The light fell strangely over Falkland, that demuted, like the breath of a dying candle, as though the sun itself hesitated to bear witness. August of 1600, and the heather moaned underfoot, while the air held that uncanny stillness, the kind that only comes before a betrayal. Scotland was restless, stitched with whispers, and in its tangled crown of royal games. The name Ruthven had begun to shimmer first with prestige, then with peril. The Gowrie house stood tall in Perth, grey and orderly, but within its walls that morning something crooked had begun to unfold. John Ruthven, the third Earl of Gowrie, young and ambitious, had summoned the king himself with strange news. A foreign man, captured, hidden in their cellar, clutching treasure gold enough to rewrite a family's future. His younger brother, Alexander, gentle-faced and dangerous, delivered the invitation like a poisoned prayer. James VI, monarch of a kingdom still shivering from civil scars, was not a man to ignore whispers of conspiracy or gold. He came with a small hunting party, unarmored, uneasy. He left the grounds of Falkland and entered Ruthven's domain not as a king, but as a man stepping into the hollow mouth of history. Within Gowrie House no golden prisoner was found, only shadows, only locked doors, only the flicker of betrayal. In the stone stairwell, accounts fracture here, as though truth itself was stabbed alongside the brothers. The king later claimed he had been lured into a chapel, Alexander drawing a dagger, John rallying soldiers. But just as suddenly as the plot ignited, it collapsed in a storm of steel. Both Ruthven brothers were cut down. Their blood soaked the oak floors. Their bodies were dragged and hung in Edinburgh for all to see, mouths open as if still trying to confess or deny. But the truth slid from their corpses like mist. And then the rumours began that Queen Anne, James's wife, had dealings with the Ruthvens, and one had been seen with her jewelled bracelet, an intimate token not easily mislaid. That there were debts owed, ancient and sacred, between the king and the Ruthven line, and their erasure came not by coin but by sword. That letters had passed, hands love letters, threats, bribes, that the king had come not to be ambushed, but to ambush. James moved quickly after. He declared the Ruthvens traitors. He burned their memory from official records. He destroyed the very name. Ruthven was forbidden to be spoken in public, struck from title and crest alike. It was not enough to kill them. They had to vanish. But even silence leaves a shape. Historians unearthed the story centuries later, and still no consensus is held. Some say it was real, a failed coup, a bid for royal replacement. Others say it was a preemptive purging, too aware of the sharpness of young ambition. What makes the story darker is its precision. So few survivors, so few words. The only voices allowed were royal. The only ink preserved was James's. Yet what monarch, genuinely attacked, waits hours to announce the crime? Why did no one outside the king's circle hear the supposed cries for help? Why did the Ruthvens make no public demand, raise no army, brandish no cause? They were clever boys, raised in courts. They knew the weight of accusation. And still they died wordless. A pale shadow drapes the staircase of Gowrie House, where it said Alexander cornered the king. Some say you can still hear a scuffle, see a blur in the stone. Others believe it's only guilt, collective, inherited, unnamed. There is no record of gold, no trace of the alleged foreign prisoner, no motive recorded that justifies the brothers' risk. Just blood, silence, and the king's voice rising in the dark like a bell calling sinners to prayer. What truth was buried that day? Did the Ruthvens fall upon royalty, reckless with fury and dreams of thrones? Or did the king, so used to masks and mirrors, orchestrate the entire affair prelude to a throne unchallenged, a page cleaned with crimson ink? The corridors of history often echo with lies shaped like law. The deeper we walk, the more the story decays, leaving us only the bones of a betrayal, and no flesh left to name the heart behind it. So Falkland sits quiet still, its grass grown thick over ghosts. Gowrie House is gone now, demolished, but the place remembers. The soil darkens where the roots once drank blood. The air still feels hollow in August, and in the long Scottish dusk, some say you can feel the brothers standing at the door again, waiting, hoping the king will come once more, and this time listen. But kings do not listen to ghosts, and the living do not speak the names of the damned. A pale wind coils through the thickets of Lower Austria, brushing against the broken boughs outside a hunting lodge cloaked in frost. It is quiet now, too quiet, as if nature itself remembers the sound that once ruptured its silence. The thunder of a gun, the thud of a collapsing body, the final, breathless gasp of two doomed lovers. Maeling, they still whisper, Maeling, where blood stained the snow, and the empire's delicate future froze into a question that history could never quite answer. It was January 30th, 1889, when the stillness cracked. Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria, heir to the Habsburg throne, and Baroness Marie von Wetzera, a girl of just 17, were found dead inside the lodge. He was 30, brilliant, troubled, and too awake for the suffocating rules of his father's court. She was young, infatuated, and born into nobility, but not high enough for the world they dared to dream. The reports would call it a suicide pact. The church would deny them a proper burial. The emperor would spiral into silence. But what truly happened that winter morning remains more echo than answer. A legend carved into the fog of empire. Rudolf had long been a source of unease for Emperor Franz Joseph. He drank too much, wrote too freely, and defied the structure of the Habsburgs. He detested the military code and loathed the political repression that thickened like smoke across the empire. His marriage to Princess Stephanie had turned cold, his affairs more frequent. And then came Mary, passionate, impressionable Mary, who scribbled letters to her mother and to the world, declaring her love, her fearlessness, her readiness to die by his side. But not all was as it seemed. The lodge was heavily guarded. That night, the servants instructed to stay away. By morning, it was too late. Rudolf had shot Mary through the head, and then himself, fat least. That was the tale given to the public. But there were cracks in the ice from the beginning. The imperial family delayed the news, edited documents, and moved Mary's body in the dead of night to prevent scandal. Her family was forbidden to grieve publicly. The truth was quickly encased in ceremony and confusion. Some claimed it was assassination, a cover for political inconvenience. Others whispered that Rudolf had tried to escape the empire's grip one last time, dragging love with him into death. The bodies told their own secrets. Rudolf's skull bore 2 gunshots. Mary's death wounds seemed misaligned with the tale. Letters emerged Mary's farewell, loving and desperate, then vanishing again, hidden in archives, doctored, burned, rewritten. The chocolate boxes in the room half-eaten, the mirror shattered, flowers upturned, all cloaked in imperial silence. As the empire quivered with this loss, it also began to tremble beneath the weight of its own decline. With Rudolf dead, the line of succession grew thin. Franz Ferdinand, Rudolf's cousin, would inherit the crown's burden, and decades later, he too would meet death, this time in Sarajevo, under bullets that would ignite the First World War. The Meerling tragedy was the first tremor before the earthquake. The crumbling began in that quiet room where love, despair, and politics met their reckoning, and the girl Mariashi was no mere accessory to a prince's final act. Her name was erased, then restored, then buried again. Only in 2015 were her letters returned to light, speaking of their planned departure from life. But still, some doubt. Still, some wonder whether she was murdered, silenced to preserve a legacy, or whether she chose her end willingly, kissed by snow and shadow. Now, the Meerling Lodge stands rebuilt, converted into a chapel. The walls no longer echo the cries of the living. No bullet holes, no blood, just candles, prayers, and the faint imprint of a bed once tangled in royal flesh and tragic fate. Tourists walk through it with reverent quiet, not knowing what to believe. And outside, the forest breathes again. Snow falls softly on the pines. A branch snaps somewhere in the distance. And in that vast silence of winter, something lingers, still perhaps the breath of the girl who loved too deeply, or the prince who dared too much. Perhaps just the hollow hush of a crown that cracked under the weight of its own illusions. History has many locked rooms. Some are kept sealed by power, others by pain. But Meerling is a mausoleum of unspoken truths, a place where empire kissed ruin beneath the veil of love, a place where ghosts speak, not in cries, but in silence. He came from nowhere, like a fog-born ghost with soft eyes and trembling hands. On a rain-washed afternoon in 1828, as the spires of Nuremberg reached toward a bleached sky, a boy appeared, no name, no history, only a letter clenched in his fingers and a presence that felt too delicate for the brutal cobblestones beneath. His feet, his boots were worn like he'd walked from a dream. His speech was broken, stuttering, simple as if language itself had only just found him. He called himself Kaspar Hauser, but beyond the name there was nothing. He could barely hold a spoon. He knew no fire nor candle. He stared at carriages like they were beasts of myth. He asked for a horse not to ride, but to hold, to love, like a child cradles a doll. The townspeople watched him with wonder and unease. He was 17, they guessed, but moved like a wounded animal, blinking at the sun as if it might burn him. The letter he carried claimed he had been raised in isolation, never leaving a cell, never seeing another soul. He said he'd been kept in a dark room for as long as he could remember, fed bread and water, taught to write his name by unseen hands. And then, one day, he awoke to freedom. Or so the letter said, but freedom for what? For whom? Soon whispers coiled like ivy through the streets of Bavaria. This was no ordinary foundling, no wild child abandoned by fate. His features noble, brow, high cheekbones, the bearing of someone born to rule begged deeper questions. Rumors traced a path back to the court of Baden. There, decades earlier, an infant prince had been born to Charles, Grand Duke of Baden, and his wife, Stephanie de Beauharnais. The boy had died in infancy, they claimed, but others whispered of something darker, that the child had been taken, replaced by a peasant's son, and hidden away to clear the path for another heir, perhaps one born of Louise of Hochberg, the Grand Duke's second wife. The child that had vanished, had he returned? Kaspar knew. Nothing of politics, of noble blood, of betrayal that stains silver spoons and rocking cradles. But he fit too well, too eerily. And in a world that feeds on scandal and suspicion, that was enough. He became a fascination, a living riddle. Nobles came to study him, question him, feed him sweet pastries and wine to loosen the truth from his lips. He painted, wrote, learned to play piano, but there was something always slightly broken inside him, like porcelain cracked beneath the glaze. He wept at sudden noises. He dreamt of dungeons and hands that never showed faces. He was drawn to candlelight, to silence, and every time he looked into a mirror, it seemed he expected someone else to stare back. Then came the blade. It was December, 1833. Snow drifted like ash through the old stone alleys of Ansbach, where Kaspar had been living under protection. He told his guardian he was going to meet a stranger, a man who promised news of his mother. He left, his boots marking soft prints in the white. Hours passed, darkness fell. He staggered home, bleeding, a wound in his chest, deep and cruel. He gasped that he had been lured to the gardens, that a man had stabbed him. A scrap of paper was found in his coat pocket, scrawled in shaky German, hinting at betrayal and fate and punishment, but no name. He died 3 days later, his body cold, his mystery warmer than ever. Who was he? A prince, raised in chains to erase his lineage. A pawn in a royal chess game, discarded when his presence threatened the throne. Or a brilliant impostor, one whose lies became legend, whose longing for identity became its own truth. Some say he wounded himself, craving attention that the world had started to withhold. Others insist he was silenced by the very hands that once hid him, agents of a court that had already buried one child, unwilling to let another rise. The Grand Duchy of Baden denied it all. Their heir had died in infancy, they said. Kaspar was a pretender, nothing more. But there were too many shadows, too many locked doors in old palaces, too many glances shared between those in courtrooms and those in coffins. No gravestone bore his rightful name. No royal mother ever claimed him. He was lowered into the earth under the name Kaspar Hauser, and above his grave were carved the words, "Here lies a riddle of his time, whose birth was unknown, and whose death was mysterious." And still the snow falls over Nuremberg. Still the wind whispers through the old stones. Was he royalty, wrapped in rags, cast into darkness to serve another's ambition? Or was he simply a boy who believed too deeply in a story not his own? Truth, like a candle in the wind, flickers. Sometimes it vanishes, and all that remains are footprints in the frost, and a dagger left behind in the snow. The fog that clings to the Tower of London is not merely weather, it is memory. It seeps through the mortar, curling beneath stone archways, settling in the dim corners where sunlight does not dare to tread. In the stillness of midnight, if you walk softly by the walls, you might hear them, not voices, but the ache of something left undone. 2 boys once walked these halls, laughed in echoing stairwells, slept in royal linen tucked beneath vaulted ceilings, and then, without cry or candle, they vanished. It was the summer of 1483, when London baked beneath a heavy, golden sun. The city was restless. King Edward IV had died suddenly, and with him, stability. His son, young Edward, barely 12, was named successor. But the crown is never just a crown. It is a blood-drenched promise, and promises, in royal courts, are often betrayed. Edward, now Edward V, entered the Tower of London not as a prisoner, but as a prince awaiting coronation. With him came his little brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, 2 sons of a king. 2 lambs within a lion's den. Their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named protector of the realm. He was meant to safeguard the throne until Edward came of age. But history's guardians often become its thieves. The boys were lodged in the royal apartments, the most comfortable chambers within the tower. They played in the courtyards. They were seen waving from windows. Then, week by week, they were seen less, then not at all. It is here, in this silence, that the ghosts begin to stir. The Tower of London, with its thick walls and shadowed staircases, holds no shortage of secrets. But this one, the vanishing of 2 boy kings, darkened its legacy forever. By the end of that same summer, their uncle Richard was crowned Richard III. No mention of Edward's coronation was made again. The boys' names were quietly omitted. From court documents, their guards were replaced. Their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, withdrew into sanctuary. Mourning sons the world refused to acknowledge as dead. No bodies were found, no charges brought, and yet everyone knew. Rumors spread like plague. Whispers said Richard ordered their deaths to secure the throne. Others blamed the Duke of Buckingham, a noble with ambitions and old grievances. Some pointed at Henry Tudor, waiting across the sea, suggesting a deeper game unfolding, one that would not end until Bosworth's battlefield was stained red. But among the gnarled roots of power, truth and lie twisted together so tightly that no blade could separate them. Then, nearly 2 centuries later, in 1674, workmen demolishing a staircase within the tower uncovered a box, small, wooden, unmarked. Inside lay the skeletal remains of 2 children, folded together in a way that suggested not rest, but burial born of haste. Their bones, fragile and unnamed, were reburied at Westminster Abbey. Many believed, and still believe, they were the princes, but belief is not certainty, and certainty has never lived long in royal courts. Some claim the boys were smuggled out, that loyalists spirited them to safety in Flanders or France, where they lived nameless lives, trading crowns for silence. Others believe one survived while the other perished. The tale of Perkin Warbeck, a man who would later claim to be the younger prince, lit the Tudor court with dread. Was he truly Richard, returned from the dead to reclaim his birthright, or merely a clever puppet used by foreign powers to wound England's fragile crown? We do not know. We cannot know. The tower holds its dead tightly. Richard III's legacy, too, is a portrait smeared with shadow. Was he the villain Shakespeare painted twisted in body and soul, scheming behind the tapestry with a dagger drawn? Or was he a man of law and order, forced into cruelty by a world that devoured the weak? The truth lies somewhere between history and myth, where the footsteps of children vanish down stone corridors, and no one sees them again. The tower today is filled with tourists, with cameras, and chatter, with guides who recount the tale with theatrical flair. But beneath the flagstones, something mourns. The coldness in the chapel air, the quiet chill in the bloody tower, the way time seems to pause as you pass the windows from which the boys were last seen. These are not tricks of architecture. They are memory's weight, refusing to lift. 2 children once held the future of England in their hands. That future was stolen, traded for security, for power, for peace. Or perhaps it was simply erased by fear that the line of York would fracture, that the kingdom would collapse into civil war. In truth, it did anyway. The Tudors rose. From blood, the Plantagenets were buried beneath it. The roses of Lancaster and York would wilt side by side, their petals indistinguishable in the mud. And what of their mother, Elizabeth, a queen turned ghost, praying within stone sanctuaries? Her sons taken, her name hushed. She, too, vanished into the fog, leaving only broken prayers and the scent of lavender pressed between pages no longer red dot. In the tower there is a room, a small one tucked behind iron and timber, where the air never warms. Some say the boys still linger there, not as spirits, but as silence, the kind of silence that hums in your bones, the kind that asks questions no historian can answer, the kind that speaks in dreams. And so we ask again, across centuries and through veils of smoke, what happened to the princes in the tower? Were they betrayed by blood, buried by ambition, lost to history or erased from it? We do not know. We may never know, but the tower remembers. The air was heavy with incense and rot of waxen tapestries and silken betrayal. Somewhere between the velvet drapes of power and the cloistered stillness of confessionals, the breath of treason passed from lip to lip like the hiss of a dying flame. In the narrow, echoing corridors of the Louvre, where cold stone had long forgotten kindness, a name was whispered Cholet, but it was not merely a name. It was a reckoning. France, 1626, a kingdom still sharpening its edges after the wounds of the wars of religion, a king, young but weary-eyed, a cardinal, red-robed and iron-willed, and a court, perfumed with suspicion, shimmering with silken masks over iron hearts. The court of Louis XIII was no place for innocence. It was a chessboard of masks and daggers, all smiles until the moment of the blade. At the centre stood Cardinal Richelieu-gride, lean, incorruptible only in the sense that corruption bent to him. He moved not like a man of God, but like a shadow behind every throne, behind every sealed door, behind the ink of every decree. His presence chilled ambition and paralyzed defiance. Except for those who believed they could unmake him. Enter Gaston, Duke of Orleans, the king's own brother, heir presumptive, soft-hearted, foolish, a prince who gathered courtiers like dying men gather candles in a cellar vainly, blindly, feverishly. Around him swirled a cabal of restless spirits, resentful nobles, and the elegant Marie de Rohan, Duchess of Chevreuse, whose beauty disguised a mind sharp enough to cleave kingdoms. They met in salons lined with lace, under the hush of tapestries woven to hide whispers. Their dream was delicate and dangerous. Remove Richelieu, guide the young king, marry Gaston to Marie's favoured bride, and rule from behind the throne. It was the kind of dream that ruins palaces. Henry de Talleyrand Perigord, Count of Cholet, was their threadbare sword. A courtier of middling influence, lovely words, and wavering loyalty. He moved between chambers like a candle in a wind tunnel, bright, erratic, doomed. They needed a figurehead. He needed a purpose. He would come to regret both. The plot. It was a plot was all murmur and candlelight. Meetings in convent parlours, letters burned by moonlight, promises made over wine-soaked prayers. Yet in every breath lingered something off a misstep, a silence too long, a nod too slow. Betrayal did not burst in with noise, seeped in through hesitation. It is said Cholet spoke too freely. Or perhaps he was betrayed by one who wished to save themselves. The court was a maze where every door led to listening ears. Before long, Richelieu knew. Of course he knew. He always did. The trap was closed, and the punishment was not swift. It was theatrical. Chalais was seized, dragged from the salons where laughter once floated into the rot-black corridors of the Château de Nonx. He was sentenced to death, not noble death, not a clean blade at dawn, but something older, something brutal. The executioner faltered. 30 strokes, 30 splintered, weeping strokes, flesh peeled, bone broken. Witnesses said the blood soaked the very cobblestones, and that his last breath came not from the wound but from the shame of it. Marie de Rohan fled, cloaked and tearless, her footsteps echoing through the night as she vanished into exile. Her name now spoken in Venice and Brussels, but never again in court without a sneer. Gaston wept, but softly. He was spared. The king forgave, or pretended to, a brothers. Mercy dulled by distance. Others were not so fortunate. Dungeons devoured them. Cells where moss bloomed and prayers curdled. Names faded in ledgers, in whispers, in the dust between floor stones. Yet the true question festered like an infected wound. Was the conspiracy re-law? Was it conjured by Richelieu himself? A net cast wide enough to snare every flicker of disloyalty. History holds its breath. Some say the evidence was thin, stitched together by fear, that Richelieu used Chalais like bait, letting the scent of rebellion lure out the bold. Others swear it was all real, a reckless plot from restless hearts. Either way, it ended the same, with blood, with silence, and Richelieu. He remained, unmoved, unbent, the crimson shadow at the king's shoulder. In paintings, he gazes forever, forward thin lips, hard eyes, as if daring history to contradict him. What endures is not the certainty of guilt, but the cruelty of doubt. The memory of Chalais, not as a man, but as a question, a noble boy executed like a criminal, a name, once spoken with affection, now turned to ash in the mouths of those who survived. His grave is not marked. His story does not end with a monument, only the rustle of old papers. The echo of a forgotten scream beneath stone. The Duchess lived, long enough to watch kings fall and children become corpses. She smiled in exile, courted princes in distant courts, but never again touched France with bare feet. Gaston lived too, a prince whose name was always second, always half-whispered. He would never be king. In the end, ambition did not die. It changed shape, became quieter, more careful, but it never stopped breathing. The corridors of Versailles would one day echo with it again. And so we remember Chalais not because he was noble, or clever, or cruel, but because his blood stained the stage of a much older play, one where loyalty is brittle, and history rewrites those it devours. If you stand, even now, in the twilight corners of the Louvre, and close your eyes near the old tapestries, you may hear it, a breath, a whisper, not quite a voice. They plotted, they bled, but who truly held the dagger? At Cumnor Place, beneath the dim autumn sky of 1560, time held its breath. The wind did not move the trees, the birds did not sing in the hedgerows, and the manor stood like a wounded beast in the half-light, steeped in silence too heavy for a house so grand. Inside, footsteps had ceased. A candle had gone out, and at the base of the wooden staircase, a woman lay as if abandoned by the world. Amy Rotsert, young, delicate, dignified. Her name floated through corridors of power and chambers of court-like incense, fragrant and fading. She had been the wife of Robert Dudley, Queen Elizabeth's cherished favourite, a marriage quietly withering in the long shadows of ambition. And now her body, twisted and broken at the foot of the stairs, spoke more loudly than she ever had in life. Her neck was broken, that much is certain. But certainty has never quenched the thirst of whispered history. The house where she died has long since vanished, torn stone from stone, as if the land itself sought to erase the memory. But echoes remain where ivy once crawled up ancient walls. It now wraps around rumor. The wooden steps are long gone, but the splinter of scandal still pierces England's crown. The news reached London like a tremor beneath still waters. Dudley was at Windsor, close to the Virgin Queen. Their bond had already stirred gossip, a closeness many found too intimate for propriety, and now, with Amy dead, suspicion oozed through the court like oil through cloth. Was it an accident? The coroner, under pressure from all sides, declared it misfortune. But the tale refused to settle. Some said she had been suffering her body weakened by illness, perhaps cancer eating away at her from within. Others whispered of a deeper despair, that she threw herself down the stairs, her loneliness sharpened by neglect and rumors of her husband's ambition. And then came the darker thoughts, those shaped in candlelit corners, behind velvet curtains and ink-stained parchment, that Robert Dudley, driven by dreams of marriage to the Queen herself, had found Amy an inconvenient tether, that here those in his orbit had arranged the fall, that the thud of her body was not fate but a signal. Dudley swore innocence, but his name was stained. Elizabeth, ever the calculating sovereign, held him at arm's length afterward, never quite close enough to grasp the crown she wore. Whatever love had passed between them, if it had ever bloomed into something bold, it withered that day in the cold corridor of CUMNOR. Some claim the Queen wept in private. Others believe she rejoiced in the freedom. But she never married. Not Dudley, not anyone. As if Amy's broken body had become a guardian at the gate of matrimony, a warning that love for a crown comes soaked in blood. The servants at Cumnor had their say. Some spoke of shadows seen in the days before her death, visitors unannounced, doors opening at night. Amy, pale and withdrawn, telling her maid that something was coming, that all would soon be over. She insisted the entire household attend the fair that day, ordered it, made herself alone. Was she afraid or resigned? Did she send them away to protect them more, to make way for a deed she feared could not be stopped? Years later, witnesses changed their tales. Memory decayed, and the truth, if it ever walked those stairs, has long since vanished into the mists. Yet the death of Amy Robsart did more than just break a woman's neck. It broke something sacred in the quarter, faith in honor, in the clean ambition of queens and their favorites. It fractured Dudley's future, turned Elizabeth's courtship into legend, and cast a long shadow over a reign otherwise filled with golden triumph. The staircase where she fell is gone, but the idea of it remains. The fall echoes still, rung by rung, in the imagination of a nation. In portraits, Amy's face is seldom shown. No grand oils preserve her beauty. No royal painter lingered long at her side. Her image survives in fragments, descriptions, half lines in letters, gossip buried beneath ink. Her memory was shaped not by who she was, but by how she died. She became a cipher for guilt, for ambition, for love deferred, a sacrifice laid at the altar of power. And yet, what if she simply slipped? A worn hem, a rush of dizziness, the wrong step in the silence of the house. What if all the storms that followed were born from a single moment of mundane tragedy? Would history accept it? Would we? But the heart prefers mystery. The soul clings to secrets. And so Amy Robsart remains not just a woman, but a whisper, a chill in the Tudor stonework, a breath in the Queen's silence, a shadow beneath the gold. We cannot ask her what happened. We cannot question the stairs or the candle that flickered before it died. All we have are the broken pieces, a bruised body, a lover's ambition, a queen's unreadable eyes. And so the question remains, was it love that killed Amy, or the absence of it? Perhaps, in some quiet chamber of eternity, she watches still, waiting not for justice, but to be remembered, not as a scandal, not as a cause or consequence, but as herself. And until that time comes, the wind moves through the empty fields of Cumnor, and the story walks softly beside it. It began not with thunder, but with silence, a silence too still, too deliberate, like a prayer held too long in the throat. Kirk O'Field lay shrouded in night, its chapel stones slick with frost, its halls lit only by the weary flicker of oil lamps, the city of Edinburgh curled tight in sleep. But above and beneath, whispers moved like knives in dark water. There, on that February night in 1567, a man's body lay twisted in death beneath the stars. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, husband to Mary, Queen of Scots, was found not amid the rubble of explosion, but far from it, face to the sky, throat bruised, flesh untouched by flame. The house had shattered behind him, yes, but it had not killed him, and that, perhaps, is where the true detonation began. He had once been the crown's golden youth tool, elegant, of royal blood, chosen not just for alliance, but ambition. Mary, radiant and sovereign, had taken him in marriage 2 years prior, a queen, a king consort, a union meant to fuse kingdoms and fortify rule. But love, in royal courts, is rarely free of rot. By the time they came to Kirk O'Field, the marriage was decayed, unravelling at the seams like old tapestry. Darnley, once proud, had become paranoid, erratic, drunk on pride and bitter wine. He suspected plots. He sulked in the shadows of power denied. Mary, beloved but beleaguered, had begun to see in him not a partner, but a threat. Still, she tended to him in his illness. That week, Darnley was recovering from the poxum, say syphilis, others a wasting fever. He slept within the calm walls of Kirk O'Field, 2 stories high, flanked by his servant. The Queen herself visited him. She laughed softly in his room. She walked with him in gardens. But as the 7th night approached, she left for a wedding masque. She did not return in the deepest hour before dawn. The ground shook. An explosion tore through Kirk O'Field, violent, echoing, unnatural. Windows shattered across the lane. Debris flew like birds of omen. But when the people ran to the ruin, they found something stranger than fire. Darnley's body, and that of his valet, lay neatly in the orchard nearby. Clothes undisturbed, flesh pale and unburnt, no soot in the lungs, no bone shattered by blast, instead bruises at the neck. Strangler's kiss. It was not an accident. It was not the pox. It was murder wrapped in flame and misdirection. And so the eyes turned. First to James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, bold man, fierce and magnetic, a soldier of storms. It was he who controlled the palace guards, he who escorted Mary through dark corridors, he who spoke too often of loyalty in a court where loyalty meant little. Some said he had long desired the Queen, that they shared secrets, that his fingers knew her skin. And when Darnley died, It was Bothwell who gained the most, married to Mary within weeks, against protest, against sense. He seized her with a band of armed men and took her to Dunbar Castle. She claimed it was not against her will, but the shadow of consent is never simple. The nobles were outraged. The people whispered. Pamphlets flew from hidden presses, dripping with ink and accusation. A queen turned whore, they said. A husband slain for love or power. They spoke of a dark wedding born of blood. Mary's kingdom began to crack beneath her feet. Bothwell was tried for the murder but acquitted in a single day, no witnesses summoned. No justice served. And when Mary's second marriage to him was declared lawful, the nobles rebelled. Armies formed, banners rose. Mary was imprisoned. Bothwell fled into exile, to die raving and chained in a distant land. The Queen, once radiant, was forced to abdicate. Her infant son, James, was crowned in her stead. Mary crossed into England, seeking refuge from Elizabeth. But refuge is rarely what it seems. 19 years she languished, there watched, questioned, betrayed again. And in the end she died beneath the axe, clothed in scarlet, whispering of martyrs. Yet Darnley's ghost never quite left the room. Who killed him? The question remains. Some say it was Bothwell, driven by lust and cunning. Others say the nobles themselves, who feared Darnley's claim to power, his ambitions, his threats. Still others whisper Mary's name, though her eyes, in portrait and memory, remain inscrutable. Perhaps it was all of them, perhaps none. There are no surviving walls of Kirkhofield now. The site lies buried beneath the pulse of modern stone. But the air remembers. The silence remembers. And in the quiet hours of history's breath, one might still hear the echo of that cold February wind, and the crack of treason in the dark. Darnley's death was not just a murder. It was a fulcrum, a shift in the sacred balance of crowns and blood. It undid a queen, reshaped a nation, and placed James upon the throne, who would later unite England and Scotland under one sceptre. The stairwell he never descended, the hands that silenced his last breath, the pact that perhaps began with a kiss and ended in a scream. Such things are not written plainly in the ledgers of kings. They are carried instead in rumour, in the weeping stones of ruined chapels, in the inked margins of forgotten letters, in the hush between a queen's final prayer and the blade that waits to answer it. And so we ask again, not for justice, for time devours such things, but for remembrance, for in the dark old ghosts are listening, in the dark hollows of the English countryside, where the wind sighs against crumbling towers and ivy twists like sleeping serpents around stone. Belvoir Castle rises above the Vale of Belvoir like a prayer caught between heaven and ruin. Its name, from the Norman French, means beautiful view. But beauty, in those days, did little to protect what lay within. The year was 1619, a time thick with the scent of ash, damp earth, and secrets. A time when truth was a matter of rank, and whispers could burn like witch-fire. There were children once laughing behind those high windows, their footsteps echoing in the long, cold corridors. They were the heirs of the powerful Rutland line, noble blood meant to inherit not just land and title, but the burdens of centuries. But something strange began to take hold in those halls. It started softly, as all curses do. A fever, a cough, strange dreams that left pillows damp and breathless. The young sons of the Earl and Countess fell ill, first one, then the other. Their bodies weakened, their skin grew pale as candle wax, and then they were gone, laid in the cold earth beneath grieving stone angels, before their laughter ever had time to stain the air of adulthood. Grief is a strange mirror, it distorteth, it reflects, it accuses, and when sorrow grew too heavy to bear, the court turned to blame. They looked down, not up, not at the rich who feasted while the boys coughed blood into laced pillows, but at the poor who mixed herbs in silence and stitched poultices in the shadows. The Flower sisters Margaret and Philippa worked in the great house as herbalists and caretakers. Their mother, Joan, too, was known in the village for her skill in midwifery and for the old knowledge passed down through the cracks of time. They were not of noble blood, nor protected by title, and when the air grew thick with suspicion, they were dragged into its storm. They called it poisoning, dark arts, charms laid beneath pillows or stirred into milk. Joan Flower, it was said, carried a familiar black cat named Rutican, who whispered to her in the language of the devil. They spoke of poppets found in the hearth, waxen dolls pierced through with pins. It mattered not whether these were truth or fantasy, for England was still haunted by the death dance of witch trials, where superstition fed the gallows. And so the sisters were taken. Joan died before the trial could begin. Muttering prayers, saw perhaps curses on the way to prison. Margaret and Philippa stood alone before the court, without counsel, without mercy. They confessed, or so the scribes claimed. They admitted to bewitching the children, to calling upon spirits. They named their mother, they knelt, they wept, and then they were taken to the gallows on the hill, where rope met neck in a ceremony as old as the fear it served. But questions lingered in the silence that followed, whose words had led to the accusations. Was it grief twisting a mother's mourning into accusation? Was it convenience and easy story to explain an illness the physicians could not name? Or was it darker still, a tale of inheritance, of quiet resentments and hidden ambition? The Rutland line was secure once more, no heirs to complicate succession. The servants were gone, their names blackened like soot, and the castle remained, cold and still, but for the rustle of wind across its battlements. In time, the story faded from the lips of courtiers, but Belvoir Castle did not forget. There are those who say the children still wander its halls, pale and solemn, seeking voices that were silenced in their name. Others claim the black cat still prowls the grounds at dusk, eyes gleaming with something unholy. And sometimes, when the moon is low and the fire gutters in the hearth, guests speak of a lullaby echoing from nowhere, soft, broken tune hummed in the old dialects, like a mother singing her children to sleep in the dark. History remembers the names of the powerful, carves them into stone. But the accused, the wronged, the women burned or hanged with lies on their lips, they vanish like smoke. Margaret, Philippa, Joan, their graves are lost. Their trial is a blot of ink on parchment, but their story lingers like a stain in the corners of memory, a question scratched into the walls. Did they do it? Or did grief and fear weave a tale so convincing that it condemned the innocent without evidence? Perhaps the truth lies not in testimony or verdicts, but in the silence that followed the silence of a family relieved, of a castle that never spoke again, of the women it swallowed whole. And so the Vale of Belvoir remains quiet in the twilight hours, where fog rolls across the moor and the wind carries the sorrow of forgotten names. The castle still stands, its windows reflecting starlight, like old tears, but inside, in the quiet spaces between heartbeat and shadow, something lingers. Not vengeance, not justice, just a memory, refusing to die And perhaps that is the truest curse of all. Beneath the vaulted hush of Hampton Court, where candlelight once licked the faces of kings and courtiers, there still hangs a silence heavy with sorrower, silence steeped in betrayal, perfumed in rosewater and blood. The stones here do not forget. They remember the rustle of silks moving too quickly in the dark, the choking sob behind a velvet curtain, the sharp cry of a woman who once believed she was loved. Here, in these sacred chambers of power and pageantry, love has always come with a cost. It begins not with a crown, but with a kiss one stolen in a corridor where tapestries swayed like whispered warnings. Anne Boleyn, dark-eyed and clever-tongued, once paced these halls like a flame drawn forward, always forward, toward her own undoing. She was not born to be queen. She was born to be noticed, to smile slightly too long, to speak slightly too boldly, to enchant a man whose power was only matched by his suspicion. King Henry VIII did not fall in love. He consumed Anne, with her wit like a dagger and her ambition veiled in charm, was the meal he could neither digest nor discard. They married in secret, here in this very palace, by torchlight, in silence, before the world could stop them. But the silence did not last. Trumpets blared and bells tolled and gowns were sewn in gold thread. Anne was crowned, lifted high upon the dais, but the crown sat like a curse. Her womb, meant to bring forth a son, betrayed her 3 times. And when a daughter, Elizabeth, came, screaming into the world, Henry's smile never quite reached his eyes again. Accusations bloomed like black roses. Adultery, incest, treason. The charges were impossible, but convenient. Anne was imprisoned, then led to the scaffold. Her neck, they said, was too slender for the axo. A French swordsman was summoned. Quick, clean, quiet. She died praying, whispering forgiveness to a man who would never offer it in return. And the wind through the cloisters that day carried something more than mourning. It carried the sense that love, real or imagined, was too dangerous for any woman to wield in the court of a king. But the silence didn't stay empty for long. Jane Seymour, pale and obedient, filled the void like a ghost. Where Anne had laughed, Jane curtsied. Where Anne had argued, Jane nodded. Henry called her his true love. She gave him what Anne could not, a son. And then she too vanished. Childbirth stole her away, and Henry mourned her in a way he hadn't mourned the rest. Or perhaps he mourned the idea of her. The perfect wife, submissive, fruitful, dead. Catherine Howard was next, barely a woman, not quite a girl. Cousin to Anne, but a shadow by comparisons after, warmer, yet no less doomed. She danced in the halls, she giggled in the gardens, she whispered with courtiers and lingered too long in the dark. When her secrets came to light lovers past, and perhaps present, the court turned to ice. The king, older now, bloated and bitter, thundered with betrayal. She was arrested in her chamber, screaming. She ran through the halls of Hampton Court, begging to speak with Henry, pounding on the locked chapel door, barefoot and broken. The guards pulled her away. Her head fell days later on the same scaffold as Anne's. Her crime was love, or the echo of it, unwelcome and unapproved. Each queen left behind a silence, a chamber that no longer laughed, a garden that no longer bloomed. Hampton Court is littered with such absences. Rooms that once rang with music now echo only with footsteps. Love, here, was not a sanctuary, it was a snare, a whispered confession, overheard by the wrong ear, a letter discovered too late, A glance, misread, and punished with blood, and always, at the centre, stood Henriking, husband, executioner. A man haunted by the absence of heirs and the presence of suspicion. He claimed to act for God, but it was fear that ruled him. Fear of betrayal, of impotence, of obscurity. So he destroyed the women who reminded him he was mortal. Even now, when the moonlight floods the courtyards and the wind sighs through the chimneys, the past refuses to rest. Visitors speak of cold spots and phantom music, of a woman in white drifting down the stair, Catherine's ghost, they say, still searching for mercy. Others hear a laugh, too bright to belong to the living, echoing from the gallery where Anne once turned heads. Some feel only unease, as though the palace itself is watching, waiting, remembering. What secrets died with those queens? What truths were never spoken, silenced by fear and steel? Perhaps Anne never betrayed her king. Perhaps Catherine was guilty only of youth. Perhaps Jane, quiet Jane, wanted more than she dared say. But they are gone, and the stones do not speak plainly. They murmur, they sigh, they warn. Hampton Court remains. Its walls hold centuries of breath. They have seen desire masquerade as duty. They have seen affection twisted into accusation. And they have seen love bright, fragile, terror lead women to their deaths. The palace endures not because of the kings who ruled there, but because of the queens who suffered. It is a reliquary of their silence, a monument to longing. And as night falls, and the last candle is snuffed out, one wonders, what did they whisper to the walls in their final hours? And who, if anyone, was listening? At the edge of France's velvet century, in a kingdom where every shadow seemed stitched from silken secrecy, there lived, though perhaps it is better said, endured a man whose name was forbidden, and whose face no living soul was meant to remember. His days were measured not by sunrises or church bells, but by the soundless clink of shackles, the shuffle of masked guards, and the unspoken weight of a secret so vast it was sealed behind iron and myth. He came to the Bastille in silence, veiled, unchained in public only once, yet never truly seen. The year was 1669, or perhaps 1670. Dates waver like candle flames in courtly records. What remains certain is this: the man was imprisoned under the care of Bénigne d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars, a loyal governor whose every order was delivered with icy reverence. The prisoner travelled under false names, Marchiali, or sometimes simply the Masked One. When he was moved, he rode beneath black velvet canopies. When he spoke, no one answered. When he breathed, it was within stone walls that did not echo. The mask always, the mask was, of black velvet at times, though legends replaced it with iron, heavy, humiliating, eternal, as if the face beneath it might strike dead. The truth of monarchy with a single glimpse. What sin could demand such exquisite punishment? Some whispered he was the elder twin of Louis XIV, hidden to preserve the throne's singular glory. An accident of birth, a royal mirror turned threat. Others claimed he was a lover betrayed, or a nobleman fallen from grace, or the king's own father, known too intimately by a queen, too silent in her confessions. There were tales of priests who heard confessions to damning, musicians who played melodies to true, even diplomats whose lips once curled around secrets that could cleave the crown from its head. France, ever perfumed with opulence and rot, birthed 100 such rumors, but none could confirm what truth had been entombed beneath the mask. His cell was bare, but not brutish. He was afforded linen, meals prepared with quiet care, Books sometimes, though what titles were granted, remains lost to fire and fear. The guards, all hand-picked and sworn by blood or bribery, were never to speak his name. One slip meant death. There were slits in the wall for food, for wine, for wordless communion with his captors. No visitors, no trial, no explanation. Imagine the weight of such solitude. A life where no one ever looks you in the eye not from disgust, but because they must not see, where even your reflection becomes a stranger. Days drip like wax, pooling into years, then decades. 34 of them passed in this ritual of erasure, and still he endured. Some claim he grew serene, even polite, a man broken into grace. Others say madness twitched at his fingertips, that he muttered half-prayers in languages forgotten, that he stared into the candlelight until it blurred and danced like ghosts on the wall. But no one saw tears, no one heard screams, not once, as if the mask had absorbed not only his identity, but his very soul. He died in 1703, buried under yet another false name, Marchiali. The parish register recorded it without ceremony. A body laid to rest, a mask buried with him, or perhaps not. Perhaps it was burned, destroyed, or handed to another as a warning. No relic remains. No tombstone whispers his truth. Voltaire, who lived through the waning of the Sun King's golden dusk, wrote of him as a secret too shameful for France to face. Dumas, centuries later, gave him the beauty of fiction, shaping him into a prince exiled by destiny. But even in their words, he remained a shadow draped in possibility, a riddle swaddled in silence. What made him dangerous was not what he had done, it was what he knew. In monarchies, where bloodlines are sacred scrolls and bastards can spark revolutions, a name is not merely a label, it is a weapon. If he was a twin, his existence alone could split the realm. If he was a lover, his silence was protection and threat. If he was a priest, a noble, a royal confidant, then he was memory personified, breathing proof of something the crown would kill to forget. And so they did not kill him, not directly. They unmade him. They dressed the act in sheets, seasoned meat, a prison not of filth but of isolation so complete it blurred the soul. He was allowed to exist, but not to matter. And perhaps that is the cruelest fate of all. Tonight, if you walk along the Seine beneath a moon cracked by cloud, and you pass by the shadow where the Bastille once stood now, devoured by time and revolution, pause, listen to the stillness, not for screams or chains, but for the soft exhale of a life once locked away, not for what he said, for no words survive, but for what he was never allowed to say. His story is not one of justice or vengeance or even betrayal. It is a story of erasure, of a life reduced to rumor because the truth was too dangerous. A secret so potent it had to be silenced, not with death, but with eternal forgetting. But in the end, the silence was not enough. We still whisper, we still wonder, and sometimes that is all a legend needs to survive. It began with bells and veils, soft lute strings drifting across a sun-dappled Paris. The summer of 1572 brought a rare hush of peace to a kingdom long torn by war, where Catholic and Protestant blood had soaked the soil for decades. And now, in the shadow of the Louvre's cold stone and towering spires, the union of Margaret of Valois and Henry of Navarre was to be the bomb. A royal wedding, golden, solemn, sacred. But the scent of roses could not hide the iron beneath. Peace was only a whisper over a drumbeat of vengeance. They came in silks and brocade, men of the Huguenot faith, drawn from every corner of France by promises of tolerance, feasts, and fragile unity. Paris, a city choked with suspicion, opened its gates to them reluctantly. Their swords were sheathed, their prayers quieter than the bells. They entered with hope. They would leave in silence. Candlelight flickered against the velvet drapes of the royal chambers. Catherine de' Medici, mother to kings and architect of whispers, moved like a shadow between rooms. Her eyes, dark, unreadable, watched the shifting tides. Some said she smiled too little. Others said she never stopped smiling. What she feared, none knew. But her son, the boy King Charles IX, trembled in her presence like a flame too close to wind. He was crowned, yes, but it was she who held the crown, and so the wedding began. On August 18th, amid soaring choirs and rain-slicked courtyards, Margaret wed Henry, she, a daughter of France, in pearls and white. He, a Huguenot prince, rougher, darker, crowned not just by title, but by survival. The crowds wept, cheered, prayed. Church bells clanged in uneasy celebration. For a breath, it seemed the bloodshed had ceased. But behind locked doors, the pact was cracking. Margaret would later whisper that her wedding night was not filled with love, but dread that she was used, politicized, thrown into bed with peace as a disguise. And Henry, clever and restless, sensed the trap tightening. 6 days passed. Then came the shot in the dark. Admiral Gaspar de Coligny, a Huguenot leader and one of Henry's closest allies, was ambushed in the street, his hand shattered, his flesh torn. He did not die, not yet. But the message was received. Trust was a blade. Panic bloomed. The Protestant nobles, guests in this city of Catholic stone, crowded the Louvre with fury. Henry paced the halls, his crown heavier by the hour. Charles IX grew pale, his voice raw. From shouting at shadows only he could see. And Catherine, unmoved, whispered something into his ear that history would never recover. Then came the night of St. Bartholomew, August 24th. The bells tolled once more, this time not for marriage, but for death. Paris awoke to screams. The gates were closed. No escape. The city turned inwards, cannibalistic and drunk on hatred. Catholic mobs, emboldened by whispered orders from royal lips, swept the streets. Houses were broken open like eggs. Men were thrown from windows. Children pierced on pikes. Women dragged by their hair through blood-soaked alleys. The Seine, once silent and slow, turned red and glutted with bodies. In the windows of the Louvre, Margaret held her breath as the screams rose. She would later write that she saved a man that night, a Huguenot, who hid in her chamber, trembling in his own blood. She refused to let the guards kill him. Her dress was stained, her innocence gone. Henry survived, but not by virtue. He bowed his head, attended Mass, whispered Catholic prayers he did not believe. He wore survival like armor. And when the killing ebbed, when the days turned back into silence, he walked from the palace, hollow-eyed and unharmed. The marriage stood, the love did not. In the countryside, the horror spread like a plague. Towns turned on neighbor. Villages erupted in slaughter. By the end, thousands were dead. Some say 5,000, others say 30,000, but numbers mean nothing when ghosts fill the air. France had married peace and then murdered it in its sleep. Back in Paris, the royal court dined as bodies floated past the palace walls. Catherine de' Medici, draped in black and pearls, poured wine with hands that did not tremble. Charles IX played with his hounds, but his eyes were wild, his mind unraveling. He would not live long. Guilt or something darker burned through him. He died 2 years later, his lungs blackened, his soul rotting from within. Henry, the groom of blood, escaped back to Navarre. He would one day return, older, colder, and take the crown himself. As Henry IV of France, he would convert once more. Paris is worth a mass, he said. He would end the wars, but he would never forget. Margaret, Queen of Navarre, would live on, isolated and scandalized. Her letters are the last warmth in this tale, scattered with sorrow, intelligence, and a woman's ache for something gentler. She was a witness, a pawn, a bride in the shadow of massacre. Her love, if ever born, drowned with the others, and Catherine, she was buried at St. Denis, where queens lie in marble, unblinking. But some say her tomb is hollow, that her soul never settled, that the whispers of that week, the wedding, the wound, the weeping, kept her spirit walking through the Louvre, not in mourning, not in regret, but in silence. The bells that once tolled for joy would never sound the same again, because in Paris, beneath centuries of stone and soot, the blood of August still lingers, not in stains, but in silence. A silence so deep it drowns, and somewhere, behind the velvet curtains and ancient tapestries, a promise remains spoken at the altar, then broken at the blade. They called her mad, but madness is so often the name. Men give to a woman who sees too much, remembers too long, or loves too deeply, in the cloistered silence of Tordesillas, where the fog clung to the iron bars like mourning veils and the candles wept their wax onto cold stone floors. There lived a queen no one dared crown, Joanna of Castilwana, the loca daughter of monarchs, mother of an empire, widow to a ghost, prisoner to them all. She was born beneath banners and cathedral bells, swaddled in royal blood and expectation, the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the Catholic monarchs who had united Spain. She was never meant to rule. Her elder siblings stood in line ahead, bright stars in a firmament of dynastic ambition. But fate, relentless as a falling sword, carved away each contender. Her brother died, her sister too. Her sister's son vanished into the grave before manhood. And so the crown crept closer to Joanna. They sent her north to wed Philip of Burgundy, son of the Holy Roman Emperor, a Habsburg with fair hair and cold hands. She went young, her heart unarmored, and against all predictions, against the dry arithmetic of arranged marriages, she loved him deeply, madly, the kind of love that twists itself into the bone, into the breath. But he did not love her as she did him. He was handsome and ambitious, bedded courtiers behind brocade curtains, smiled while slipping away, yet she clung to him. Her affection did not dissolve, it curdled into obsession. When he was with her, she burned. When he was gone, she raged. They said she screamed through the corridors, tore at her hair, cursed the women who laughed with him. When her mother died, Castile passed to Joanna, but she was no longer simply daughter or wife. She was queen, and a queen inconvenient as a queen endangered. Her father, the calculating Ferdinand, saw her grief as weakness. Her husband saw her crown as his. They each tried to rule in her name, and when that failed, they ruled without her. Then came the moment that shattered whatever held her together. In 1506, Philip died. Fever, poison, divine judgment, no one knows. Joanna, barely 30, fell into a grief so deep it seemed a descent into another world. She did not scream. She did not wail. She simply refused to bury him. They say she rode through the night with his coffin in a cart drawn by black horses, stopping only at monasteries where no women dwelled. She whispered to the corpse as if it still breathed. She opened the casket to gaze on his face by torchlight. She kissed the lips that had grown cold. The people whispered madness. Her father whispered in fit. The church frowned. The court recoiled. And while the shadows lengthened over Castile, Ferdinand came with soft speech and quiet guards. He coaxed her into the royal palace at Tordesillas, and once inside, locked the doors behind her. It is there she remained. Not for a season, not for a mourning year, but for nearly 5 decades. The palace was no home, but a hushed sepulchre. Heavy drapes dimmed the light. Doors groaned shut like tombstones on hinges. Joanna slept in a chamber beside Philip's coffin, for years, until the rot could no longer be hidden. Even when they buried him at last, she demanded the crypt remain open, so that his spirit could rise if it chose to. She prayed, she sang. She watched the seasons pass through slivered windows. Her hair greyed like frost creeping across a mirror. Her hands folded over letters never sent. She signed decrees when permitted, her handwriting still firm, still regal. She was lucid, say some. She was cunning, say others. But above all, she was alone. And even when Ferdinand died, her son Charles, who became Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of a world that stretched across oceans, did not set her free. He visited once. The guards said she wept when he left, her voice, breaking with hope, quickly murdered. He, too, found her inconvenient. A living queen with claim to Spain, memory of betrayals, and a flame that still flickered faintly behind her eyes. Years turned the iron of her prison into rust. The world changed outside. New worlds conquered, wars won and lost, monarchs crowned and buried. Inside, she remained still. She muttered to unseen listeners. She blessed the air. Some said she went barefoot, refused to bathe. Others claimed she starved herself until bones pressed against her skin like carved ivory. When she finally died in 1555, the world barely noticed. They buried her beneath the chapel floor beside Philip, as she had always desired. Perhaps she smiled then, in the silence beyond breath, where politics and betrayal could no longer follow. And yet was she truly mad? Or was her madness merely a cloak thrown over something more dangerous? A woman who remembered, a queen who refused to yield, a heart that mourned too long, too fiercely, for men to bear in the end. It does not matter what they called her, mad, hysteric, broken queen. In that cold stone palace, she carved a legacy not of policy or conquest, but of endurance. She became a myth, swaddled in candlelight and silence, floating like incense through the centuries, and sometimes, when the bells toll low in Castilian cathedrals, when the moon hangs over the Tordesillas like a mourning veil, it said her. Ghost walks still barefoot, whispering prayers to the man who once turned his back to her love, and to the son who left her in the dark, not mad, not broken, merely ... remembered. It gleamed like a wound in the dark, set deep in the crook of a bony finger. The emerald glowed with an eerie green, fire, not bright, not warm, but cold, ancient, watchful. In the flickering shadows of the court, Catherine de' Medici wore it always. The ring never left her hand. It was no mere ornament, it was an eye. Some whispered it was a spy of the devil, others said it housed the soul of a drowned prophet. But to Catherine it was a confidant, a mirror, a mouth that never spoke yet always told the truth. The ring had no origin anyone could trace. Some said it had come from the east, smuggled in a velvet pouch soaked in wine and ash. Others claimed it had been pried from the tomb of an Egyptian priestess by a mad Florentine collector who later threw himself from a tower, screaming of green fires in his skull. Wherever it came from, it arrived with Catherine when she crossed into France a bride cloaked in silks. Widowed dreams and superstition at court, she listened more than she spoke. Her dark eyes watched the men who dismissed her as foreign, as Italian, as barren, as poison. But power grew quietly around her, like ivy in a crypt. And on her hand that emerald pulsed, always cool, always heavier than gold should be. Catherine believed in omens. She studied the stars with court astrologers. She lit candles for prophets. And the ring was never far from her reach when decisions were made. At the execution of the Duke of Montmorency, she touched the emerald and said nothing, but those nearby claimed the stone turned darker blacker than blood as the axe fell. In moments of plague, famine, war, she would sit in her chambers by candlelight, holding it near her face, staring deep into the green depths until the wax burned low and the shadows lengthened. Some said she could see the future. In it, others claimed she only saw what she already feared. Then came the vision. They say it happened in winter. The sky was full of grey ash and silence. Snow lined the courtyards like funeral lace. Catherine sat alone before the hearth, the fire dancing in her eyes. She lifted the ring before her gaze, as she often did, turning it slowly. And in the green, something moved. A shape. A boy, crowned, coughing blood onto marble. A royal cloak soaked in red. A mother, weeping not from grief, but from certainty. She saw her son Henry, her second-born, dead before he ever wore the crown. Years passed. Her eldest son died young. Her next Henry ascended, just as the emerald had shown. And he, too, would die violently, stabbed through the belly by a mad monk. Catherine did not weep at his funeral. She wore mourning black, but her eyes were dry. It had already happened, long ago, inside that stone. She had watched his death years before, again and again, like a terrible prayer. The court grew wary of the ring. There were whispers among the ladies that it throbbed when touched by traitors, that it grew warm when lies were spoken, that it could not be removed unless it willed it. Catherine once offered it to her youngest son, Francois, but when he tried it on, his skin blistered. He screamed, and the ring fell, clinking on the floor like a cursed bell. No one touched it again. Even her enemies believed it was not just a jewel. Protestants called it a devil's stone. Some said it fed on blood, that every death Catherine ordered strengthened it. On the night of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, she wore it proudly. As the city of Paris bled, as the Seine turned red, as screams echoed beneath cathedral bells, Catherine dined with the king. The ring glittered at her table, and some servants said it pulsed like a heartbeat. When she died, it was gone. No record, no mention in the inventories, no entry in the royal archives. Her other jewels were catalogued, divided, stolen, sold, but not the emerald. It vanished like breath into fog. Rumors flared like candlelight. Some said it was buried with her, hidden inside her ribcage, pressed between her clasped hands. Others claimed it was smuggled from France by a loyal servant, passed through secretive hands, traded in whispers for power always cursed. Decades later, a green ring surfaced in a pawnshop in Naples. The owner went blind within a week. A cardinal bought it for his mistress. She died childless, her womb sealed like a tomb. And then came Napoleon. It is said that among the jewels taken from ravaged lands, he found a ring that chilled his hand. He gave it to Josephine. She wore it once. Their line, too, died out. Today, there are those who say it lies behind glass in the Louvre, unlabeled, mistaken for a trinket. Others believe it was locked away in a chamber beneath the palace, its green fire too dangerous for the light. But wherever it is, the curse remains. Catherine's bloodline extinguished, her power dismantled, and yet her legend lives on. They called her sorceress, queen, widow, mother. They said she loved poison more than perfume. But perhaps all she truly loved was the one thing she could trust, the stone that never lied, the eye that always saw, the cold emerald that whispered futures in a court full of daggers, and in the dead of night, when the candles are low and the air tastes of metal and old stone, some say you can feel it. That quiet pulse beneath the earth, waiting, watching, still green, still alive. It is said that the forgotten are the ones who linger longest in the walls, in the still, ivy-wrapped chambers of Sandringham House, long after the guests had gone, and the corridors had fallen into hush. There was once the faint echo of a boy's laughter, a sound so light, so delicate, it could have been the brushing of moth wings against drapery. But it was real, once. A child's voice, giggling at model trains and birdsong, now sealed behind the thick velvet curtains of royal silence. Prince John, the boy behind the veil. Born in 1905, the youngest child of King George V and Queen Mary. He came into the world not with a fanfare, but a whisper, and in time that whisper would be all that remained. He was a royal son, yet kept away from the public gaze, shrouded in secrecy like a blemish to be concealed under velvet. He had soft brown eyes, they say, with a gaze that drifted skyward as though he heard things others could not. His hands were gentle, his spirit odd and radiant, his love for gardens and steam engines unmatched. But the world he was born into had no place for such beauty, not in its royal halls. Epilepsy, the word carried terror in Edwardian Britain. Madness, possession, punishment. His seizures began at 5, and with them his isolation. His body convulsed, and so did the monarchy, tightening around its image, its need for perfect lineage, perfect heirs, perfect masks. The more his mind bloomed in different colors, the more they turned the lights off around him. He was moved to Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, a quiet house among trees and fog, far from the throne rooms and ceremonies. There he lived with a nanny and a small staff. There the curtains were drawn. There the boy who loved toys and laughter and sky was placed where no one could see. Some say his mirror was turned to the wall, that his reflection, his self, was too much to behold, too fragile, too human, and yet the servants remembered. They told of a boy who tended flowers with trembling hands, who waved at sparrows and named them as if they were friends. He adored his brother George, who visited when duties allowed. For those few who saw him truly not as a prince, but as Johnny, he was more light than shadow. The seizures were cruel, yes. They took him from himself, but he returned each time for a while and laughed again. When war came in 1914, the world forgot children. Death poured like rain across Europe, and in royal courts, strength became spectacle. Vulnerability was exile. Prince John, now nearing adolescence, became the ghost prince, absent from public events, erased from photographs, his name never uttered. In speeches, his presence's secret wound behind the marble smile of monarchy. On a cold January morning in 1919, a storm broke in the boy's body. A seizure struck hard, harder than any before. He collapsed under the winter light. By the time they reached him, the boy who had never truly been allowed to live had died. He was 13. No royal funeral, no public mourning. He was buried in a small plot near the church on the estate, beside whispering trees, under the cold sky he once loved. His parents did not attend. His room remained untouched. For years, his name vanished from lips and letters. The palace did not speak of him. Portraits skipped over his face. Biographies excluded him as though he had never drawn breath. But the servants remembered, the gardeners, the old nurses, the ones who had known the boy behind the seizures, the boy who had built tracks for his toy trains, who had smiled with his whole soul, who had kissed the cheek of his nanny as if she were a queen. Time passed, wars came and went, thrones trembled. But in a locked room at Sandringham, the toys gathered dust, and the light shifted across the walls as if trying to find a child's shadow. They say he still walks there, in silence, a gentle presence, not haunting, not angry, just unfinished. A soul half told, a question left unanswered. Why did they hide him? What fear did a child's fragility spark in a monarchy built on image and steel? Some say his illness was shame. Others believe he was mercy kept from a world that would have broken him. But in truth, he was neither curse nor symbol. He was simply a boy who loved things, a boy who suffered, a boy who should have been allowed to be. It is easy to mythologize kings, to sculpt them into legends and lineages. But the smallest lives the quiet ones, the trembling ones, the most human. Prince John was not a chapter in royal grandeur. He was a hidden verse, a soft, sorrowful poem sung behind the stone walls of Sandja, Anda, and now, at last, the silence that once entombed him has begun to crack. His story, once buried like frost beneath royal boots, now rises like mist in the morning, not for glory, not for guilt, but because even forgotten children deserve to be remembered, especially the ones who were never allowed to be seen. In the flickering breath of gaslight, she moved like a phantom slender, veiled, wreathed in silence. The Empress of Austria, they called her Elizabeth Sissi. But to those who dared draw closer, she was something else entirely, a poem never recited, a shadow stitched in satin. Her smile was porcelain, her eyes mirrors to something lost. They whispered that she did not walk, she drifted, that her reflection sometimes did not follow, that she once wept so long the lace on her collar turned to salt. To enter her world was to enter a cathedral of grief. Vienna was a palace wrapped in mirrors, and inside those mirrored halls, Sissi lived like a trapped ghost. Her hair, black as midnight soil, flowed like a river down to her calves. Each day, she submitted to a ritual of brushing and braiding, lasting not minutes, but hours. Maids were forbidden to speak during these sessions. If a single strand was pulled too sharply, the Empress would fall into days of silence. Her vanity was lined with tonics, vials, oils from Morocco, ivory combs, and crystal pins. She rarely ate, surviving on milk, broth, orange peels. Her waist corseted down to 16 inches, leaving bruises like blooming violets across her ribs. And yet, this was not vanity, it was Armadot. The empire she married into was made of ceremony and silence. Her husband, Emperor Franz Joseph, was a statue, inhuman-formed, dutiful, distant, carved from duty and marble. The court was cold, ruled by her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, who called Elizabeth a child and unfit. They took her children from her arms. They shaped her into a doll and locked her in a jewel box. Sisi was not born to reign. She was born to vanish, so she did. By her 30s, she no longer posed for portraits. She forbade photographs. When traveling, she wore thick veils. She took to walking alone in woods, in cemeteries, in storms. Her thoughts were inked into diaries, hundreds of pages in Hungarian and Greek, soaked with longing, poetry, and sometimes fire. She was fluent in escape. She traveled obsessively Ireland, Madeira, Algeria, Corfu, each place a mirror, each sea a whisper. She built a palace in the Greek style, named it Achaleion, and filled it with statues of dying heroes. She studied Homer and quoted Sappho. Her body stayed thin, but her spirit grew vast. Still, something was unraveling. One tale claims that she soaked her pearls in arsenic, a poison diluted over years, dripping into her blood like memory. It was a whisper of control in a world where all was dictated. Others say she sought out anarchists not to betray the throne, but to understand the pulse of rebellion. Her sympathies lay with the broken, the unseen. In her letters, she called herself a seagull, flying always, landing never. She once wrote that the soul has wings, but the crown weighs them down. And then came Geneva. It was September 1898. The Empress, travelling under an alias, arrived with her lady-in-waiting. She wore black, always black, her hair pinned high, her face half hidden beneath a veil. She moved like someone already mourning. That day, she had been persuaded to leave her hotel and catch a steamer. As she walked along the lakefront promenade, a man approached. He stumbled forward, as if to greet her. Then, he plunged a sharpened file just a few inches into her chest. She did not scream. She did not fall. She walked on 10-20 steps. A flicker of confusion. She clutched her parasol. The blood did not bloom immediately. It remained within her, hidden like everything else. But inside, her heart was bleeding. When she finally collapsed, her lady thought it faintness, the corset. Again, perhaps. It was only later that they found the wound so small it could have been missed. But it had pierced her heart by the time she reached her hotel bed. It was too late. The woman who had run from thrones, mirrors, portraits, and expectations had met the one thing she did not resist: death. Some say she welcomed it, that she had long walked beside it, spoken to it in dreams, braided it into her hair like black ribbon. Her diaries, those last flickering confessions, were ordered burned by her daughter. The empire erased what it could. The world remembered the myth, the beauty, the sorrow, the corset, but not the woman. Not the words she burned into night. Her funeral was royal, grand, distant, but her soul, it lingers not in marble tombs, but in silence, in old mirrors, in crumbling palaces, in wind crossing the Danube, in dark pearls kept in velvet drawers. They say one of her corsets still lies folded in a drawer at Schönbrunn Palace. If you touch it, the silk feels cold, as if it remembers, as if it mourns. And somewhere, far beyond time and history, a woman still walks the marble halls alone, hair brushing her heels, eyes searching for the sea. Not lost, just unseen. And when night falls softly over Vienna, you might hear her steps in the hush, slow, deliberate, a lullaby of sorrow echoing between chandeliers, for Empress Elizabeth was never truly part of this world. She was always fading, always flying, always one breath from disappearing into legend, in the dim halls of Portuguese memory, where candlelight flickers against cracked frescoes and dust sleeps thick on forgotten tomes. There was once a woman whose name was spoken only in whispers, Mariana. The syllables floated like incense through the corridors of the royal court, sweet and dangerous, vanishing into the vaulted ceilings before they could settle. She was a shadow and a flame, a figure glimpsed behind silk curtains, seated at the king's right hand without crown, without portrait, without past. The year was 1640, and Portugal had just torn itself free from Spanish rule. King João IV, a man crowned amid rebellion, sought loyalty like water in a dry well. He clutched it in courtrooms, in churches, in bedchambers, and into his gilded court came Mariana, a black woman of unknown birth, once enslaved, now unshackled, by desire and circumstance. No one knew her true name, if Mariana was the one she chose or the one imposed. No one knew from which ship she came, nor which chains she had worn. But they knew this. She rose. She arrived first as a servant, silent and obedient, carrying trays of fruit and silver goblets into rooms she was not meant to linger in, but linger she did. Her presence grew bold. Soon she was not merely entering, she was seated, not merely serving, but being served. Ministers began to bow slightly when she passed. The queen turned her face to marble. Mariana's chambers grew heavy with Sentember rose, and muskanned the rustle of silk gowns gifted by foreign ambassadors. Jewels appeared around her neck like offerings. A noble title was whispered into her ear by the king himself, though no parchment survives to prove it. The court pretended not to notice her rise, but they noticed. Oh, how they noticed! Rumors bred like mold in the damped tapestries. They said she was a sorceress from the islands, her blood soaked with the magic of forgotten gods. They said she walked barefoot through the palace gardens at midnight, speaking in tongues to trees that bent toward her like supplicants. Some claimed she cursed those who opposed her. One nobleman coughed blood for weeks, after calling her a whore behind closed doors. Another found his ships sunk, his sons fevered, his wife barren. But power never wears a simple face. And the truth was likely more layered, more tragic, more quietly burning. The king, it was said, listened to her, not just in bed, but in council. Her voice, measured and strange, began to echo in royal decrees. Foreign diplomats took note. They called her a Morenita, with both reverence and disdain. They called her a danger. In secret correspondence, ministers lamented her unnatural influence. The church grew restless. Whispers reached the Inquisition's ear, veiled as concern for the soul of the nation. And then, as if she had never existed, Mariana vanished. There was no announcement, no funeral, no exile decree. Her rooms were emptied in silence. The ruby ring the king had given her reappeared on his mistress's finger. Her gowns were refitted for other courtiers. Her name, already rarely written, was struck from letters, as if ink itself refused to remember. When questioned, João IV said nothing. The queen smiled again, cold and relieved. Some believe Mariana was poisoned, perhaps with a kiss or a wafer at mass. Others claim she was bribed into leaving, offered land and silence in some far-off province. A few romanticize her escape. In the night aboard a merchant ship, her jewels sewn into her bodice, her spells buried beneath moonlit soil. But most agree on this: she was erased, not by fire or sword, but by omission, by shame. And yet history has seams, and Mariana left traces in the hem, receipts for gowns ordered in her name, a letter from a frightened nobleman begging her favor, a stained page in the king's private ledger, to Mariana for services rendered, fragments, yes, but fragments that resist the void. Historians now walk through archives like archaeologists through ruins, brushing dust from her ghost. There are those who say she was nothing more than a mistress, that her race and rise were sensational, her fall inevitable. But then why the fear? Why the secrecy? Why burn her name so thoroughly from the palace walls? Perhaps it was not what she was, but what she revealed, a monarchy so fragile that even the love of a black woman could crack its facade. A court so consumed with bloodlines and etiquette that it feared the honest, ungovernable shape of human desire. Mariana did not fit. She could not be tamed, not by scripture, not by crown. And in her refusal to stay hidden, she held a mirror to the court's hypocrisy. There are no portraits of her, no paintings to soften her memory into myth, no marble busts or embroidered banners. But in the silence she left behind there, she still rules. Her story is a quiet revolt, a pearl hidden in the throat of history. Not a queen, yet crowned in glances. Not a witch, yet feared like one. Not a ghost, yet haunting. And sometimes, late at night, when the palace corridors groan with age and the wind slips beneath locked doors, they say you can still hear her Marianal laughing softly, a sound like rustling silk and burning incense, walking barefoot through the dreams of kings. The halls of the Winter Palace whispered secrets long after midnight, when the wind outside raked its fingers against frosted windows and the chandeliers above flickered with the dying sighs of candlelight. Within those endless marble corridors, beneath painted ceilings and gilded mirrors, a chill lingered not from the cold, but from stories buried in silk and silence. Here power wore perfume. It came dressed in brocade and furs, and at the center of it all stood a woman who ruled an empire with her pen, her lovers, and her ruthless vision of destiny. Catherine, not just empress, not just great, but sovereign flame. She had come from the shadows of Prussia, a bride in name, a strategist in spirit, and with time she bent the mighty bear of Russia to her will. But even an empress must pay tribute to the illusion of lineage. A Serena's womb was watched like a shrine, every swell, every stillness. When her official son, Paul, entered the world, it was with as much fanfare as fear, for Paul would never be hers in spirit. He was too much his father's ghost, too much reminder of the chains she had broken. Yet there are stories soft-footed and half-spoken of other children, ones she did not claim, whose cradles were not carved in Kremlin wood, nor guarded by Cossack steel. One such whisper dances through time, tracing its way to a night thick with perfume and power. Gregory Orloff, her closest companion, a man who helped her seize the throne, shared her chambers not merely as a consort, but as a co-conspirator. It is said that from this Banda rare unguarded lover child was born, concealed as if his existence alone could shatter a glass empire. His name lost. His eyes, perhaps like hers, sharp with ambition or soft with sorrow, were never seen in court. Some say she sent him away before he ever took his first steps on Russian soil, that he was passed into foreign arms, a gift or a burden to be raised in the Baltic air or behind Prussian gates. Others murmur that he lived within sight of her, a shadow child in a distant manor, watching from afar the woman who bore him but never beckoned. A second rumour coils around the stable stalls, where straw met velvet and horses drank beside silver basins. Catherine was known to walk among the animals, unguarded, almost gentle. One evening, as a storm churned above St. Petersburg and the sky cracked like an eggshell of fire, she disappeared for hours. Her guards, it said, turned their faces, and when she returned, her fingers smelled of hay and something more elusive. It was her stable master they blamed, a quiet man with strong hands and sad eyes. A month later, he vanished, and a year after that, a babe was swaddled in secrecy and sent down river beneath moonlight. No name, no papers, just a locket tucked into the folds of his blanket, engraved with a single letter E. These were not court children, they were ghosts. They did not learn to curtsy or address ambassadors. They did not parade on holidays or feature in oil portraits. Yet there are small, persistent signs. A noble family in the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth with no known ancestry but sudden access to imperial funds. A diary entry from a French ambassador remarking on a boy with eyes too imperial for a bastard. A chest found in a crumbling estate filled with letters never scentage, sealed in wax bearing the Romanov crest. Why didn't she claim them? Perhaps because Catherine understood that to rule a realm of fire and frost, one must become myth, not mother. Her letters, those that survived the flames of court censorship, often speak of duty as a burden she wore like a jewel, too heavy, too brilliant, but always displayed. To admit such children was to crack the mirror she had crafted so carefully. One splinter, and the empire would see the woman beneath the crown. Not the mother of Russia, but a lover, a woman of flesh, of sorrow, of mistakes. Or perhaps she mourned them in silence. They say she kept a music box in her chambers, one that played a lullaby not known in Russia. She would wind it only on stormy nights. Servants would hear it echo faintly through the walls, and some swore they saw her seated by the fire, unmoving, her hand curled around a child's slipper. Though no child had entered her room, her death came without confession. No names spoken, no letters revealed, only a will, composed with care, naming no heirs beyond those the world already knew. The rest, if they ever existed, were entrusted to silence, and yet the blood remembers. In dusty archives of minor nobles, in forgotten lines with grey eyes and unspoken strength, there lingers the taste of something imperial, a certain posture, a certain way of never bowing too deeply. Could it be that the line of Catherine, born in secrecy, runs quietly through the veins of men and women who have no idea they once belonged to a crown? She ruled for over 3 decades, not with armies, alone, but with the art of vanishing truths. Her children were the empire, the enlightenment, the schools and wars she etched into stone. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was how she made peace with the children she could not keep. Or maybe, as she lay dying, her mind wandered not to the throne, not to the marble halls, but to a small face she once held against her chest. In a chamber lit only by candlelight and fear, the music box played, perhaps, one final time, and outside, the wind whispered through the trees like a lullaby. It is said that some clocks do not count time, but memory, that their gears do not measure hours, but endings. And in one quiet chamber of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, a single clock remains still its hands frozen at 1:23 a.m. The precise moment blood met stone on a summer night in your time, it seems, took a final breath and refused to move again. long before the gunfire and betrayal, before the revolution rose with fire in its throat. That clock had ticked gently above the writing desk of Tsar Nicholas II. The Winter Palace itself was a labyrinth of gold and cold marble, of chandeliers that flickered with imperial breath. It whispered with the footsteps of ghosts, even while the empire still stood. And in that single room, tucked behind carved doors and velvet curtains, Nicholas would sit with quill in hand, scribbling hopes and fears into letters, while that small, bronze clock kept silent watch. It had no name, that clock, no craftsman's mark, only a pale face with Roman numerals, and a second hand that swept with deliberate grace. No one recalls where it came from, only that it had always been there, as if the palace had grown around it, as if it had been born knowing where it belonged. On the last evening Nicholas ever saw its face, the snow was still melting in the capital, though summer's warmth had touched the world far from the palace. Far to the east, in a city soaked with rain and silence, the last Romanovs waited in borrowed rooms, beneath low ceilings, behind boarded windows. The house was called Ipativ, the house of special purpose. They named it, as if the walls themselves were aware of the part they would play. That night, the Romanov daughters, Salga Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia fastened diamonds into their corsets and bodices, not for vanity, but in hope. Jewels stitched into silk and wool, hidden close to the heart, meant to buy protection, to survive what might come. The Tsarina held tightly to her son, the sickly heir whose blood could not clot, and the Tsar, once the most powerful man in Russia, paced beneath a flickering lamp, his eyes hollowed with knowledge he could not say aloud. They were summoned in the dark, told to dress, told to wait, then marched down the wooden steps into a basement. The walls were low, the air thick with sweat and metal, and there, in the confined silence, history shattered. The gunfire began without warning. The daughters did not fall immediately. The bullets sparked against their jeweled armor, the stones sewn tight against their skin. Some screamed, some stood, some ran blindly into corners, their white nightgowns blooming red. It is said the executioners panicked, that knives were drawn, bayonets used where bullets failed, that the room became a storm of screaming, echoing metal and breaking flesh. When it ended, the silence was total in the Winter Palace. That same moment, hundreds of miles away, the little clock above Nicholas's desk stopped ticking. It simply ceased. No shudder, no slowing, no sound, just a breath held forever. 1:23 a.m. No one wound it again. The servants did not dare. The room was locked. And the empire was over. The Soviet state, born of fire and fury, refused to acknowledge what had occurred. For years, the fate of the Tsar and his family was wrapped in shadows. Rumors circled, but officials denied. The bones, when they were finally found decades later, were broken and burned, scattered in shallow earth. Diamonds were recovered among the ash, teeth, a boot, a braid of hair, but no answers, and the clock. It remained silent. It was removed during renovations, locked in storage, misplaced, forgotten, as if the memory of its stillness was too heavy to bear. But it found its way back, decades later, returned without ceremony to the Hermitage, not to tick, but to witness. It sits now in the shadows of the Winter Palace once more, untouched, unwound. The hour forever, 1:23. There are those who say the clock is cursed, that its silence binds it to that hour of blood and betrayal. that when it ticks again, something lost will return, an empire, a vengeance, a ghost. Others say it is a tombstone, not of stone or bone, but of time itself. A marker not for a man, but for a world that died with him. The end of emperors, the last breath of crowns and scepters and thrones. But there are some historians, curators, dreamers, who believe the clock waits, that it hears something beyond the ticking of hours, that it listens for footsteps not yet heard, for names not yet spoken, for a hand, soft and reverent, to wind it once more, and perhaps, if that day ever comes, the hands will move again, not toward the future, but toward a reckoning, toward a memory too sacred to forget. Until then, the clock remains, a silent witness, in a palace of shadows, the ghost of a world that once was, holding its breath, forever at 1:23.